So I was just thinking about the various different ways that we view the world and how wrong or, possibly right in terms of the explanations that we actually get. And I was thinking about, I'm listening to a podcast right now about sort of the history of economics, sort of shorthanded history of economics and how it sort of sways back and forth between, you know, starting out with a sort of very theoretical perspective and then becoming a lot more mathematical, evolving from an idea of physics and using equations and being very mathematical towards a little bit more modern stuff that is more inclusive of really unusual ideas that are being borrowed from biology, for example, and sort of evolutionary biology. And it's really quite fascinating how we grapple with trying to figure out what this sort of abstract thing we call an economy actually is and how it actually functions. It's really just a figment in our imagination to begin with, anyways, if you start thinking about it. We sort of depict things as buyers and sellers, and we have this sort of imaginary thing called a market, and we try to make sense of that. In modern day sort of society, we don't necessarily have a market the way that it is depicted as a sort of street market where you go around and pick things based on different vendors, and that doesn't necessarily exist in most places. That's a pretty unusual place. And instead, we have much more complicated things like Amazon.com, for example, that is really just one organization that tries to mimic some of these market properties. Or, we have much of our businesses done online. Before we might have had something like a mall, which was kind of like a market, but kind of not, because everything was really cookie cutter and standardized, and we didn't haggle over prices and all of this kind of stuff is really quite fascinating that we're trying to make sense of this reality using these terminologies that just don't quite work. They don't quite map on to what is going on in terms of how we feel about things, and even within an organization, which is, as a strategy person, that's what I study. I kind of sort of bounce around between outside, looking at the outside of an organization and inside of an organization. Um, and even in the sort of description of how we understand insides of organizations, it's terrible. Like they're a really almost like a pathetic way of describing. There's one way that we describe the inside of organizations that is very almost corrupt, I guess, where we have political coalitions, we have people trying to cause problems, all of these kind of ways, and then on another side, sort of the opposite side of the literature, we've got it's almost very hunky dory, kumbaya stuff where people are sitting around trying to make everybody else better, and that's probably a little bit more on some of the stuff that we understand in organizational behavior, where the ideal is everybody coming together to sort of to pursue a particular goal, and we get together and we do a good job of that. But for the most part, all of these things are very descriptive, in the sense that they are not really describing the nature of what's going on very well, and they do a very almost pathetic job of mapping on the real world and what the real world looks like. Now, um, I am very critical of this, but the reason why I'm critical of it is because it doesn't map my reality very well. And but that doesn't mean that I can't do better, right? That doesn't mean I can do better. Right? I'm just saying, like, my reality is a lot more complicated than the sort of depictions of how we understand uh, the world around us and the way that it's described. My reality is far different than what is being described. And the fact is that nobody's reality is going to be described very well with any of these theories or with any of the descriptions that we have of what things look like. And here's the thing: we can explain one phenomenon really well, and that's usually what happens. Is that we can explain a certain phenomenon quite well and being very specific, but then when we move to a different area in a different um, a different domain of what a business looks like, when we move from, say, internal of an organization in Silicon Valley to an organization in the heartland of Canada. It's different worlds, and they operate very differently, and they have many different assumptions on what is the ultimate goal. A corner store is really different than, or I guess, a bodega, I guess, is another term for it, is very different than um, how a multinational company actually operates. And we're expected to sort of depict this um, in a way that it maps onto everything. And now, of course, we have incentives that encourage researchers to just look at the multinationals. Nobody's going to look at the corner stores because nobody's paying them. There's no money there. There it is. It's unexciting because you're not making a big impact on this world because you're not looking at multinational corporations and all this kind of stuff. Um, so when you start looking at this and you start sort of going into different crevices, you just look at something slightly different. Um, maybe you look at the sex trade, for example, and the business of the sex trade, you'll realize it's far different than what is going on in other parts. And the reason is we're often not describing the world very well. And this gives me a tremendous amount of hope for science um, because it tells me when I start looking at my world and what I do and how it just all of the theories that I know of just do not map well to my own life. It gives me a lot of encouragement where I start thinking of, you know, we've got a long ways to go. How we understand the world is very superficial in a lot of ways. And part of that, the sort of superficial understanding, is, I think, and as my own view, is part of its snobbery because we don't think that ordinary and plain and simple explanations is good enough. We have to have some really abstract theoretical explanation, and that sort of that that avoids looking at ordinary things in ordinary ways. I'm very much um, critical, and I have always been very critical of the way that we view the world around us in these very superficial ways. I remember first year engineering just being so upset with physics problems because they would assume away, they would have a massless frictionless pulley, and there would be like no assumptions of what real life would be, and it would drive me bananas. But I understand why they do that, to have a base case sort of, this is the best possible option, and then you sort of build in those other assumptions later on as you get more complicated. But the fact is that we don't understand the world really well. And we don't understand how things operate very well, which gives us so much room to explore and do cool things. People think science is dead and we're running out of ideas. I think, like, are you crazy? Have you tried have looked at any real world thing? And you start looking at all of the possible explanations. You like, the explanations are not great. They don't explain everything. Now, I think people that sort of believe we're running out of ideas don't are not in the nitty gritty of it. They're not sort of looking at something in plain view. I just simply think, why not? So take a step back, right? Something very simple, like puddle, rain puddle, biology. It's probably not very well understood. And when you start taking a look at that, so you look at maybe the microorganisms that live in rain puddles. Maybe you look at what happens when there's oil from the road in rain puddles. Maybe you look at, how rain puddles, the mud sort of emulsifies in it. Like, you look at all these different angles and different ways of thinking about it, you realize that a simple rain puddle, just this little tiny thing, is very complicated and very interesting. And then you can sort of combine different angles of this and maybe you look at the surface tension of a puddle, and you see how that affects the biology of the microorganisms that are in it, and you start like looking at these different things. You realize we know nothing. We really do not know anything, and you might think, like, why do we need to understand a rain puddle and all of this stuff about a rain puddle? It's because it is symptomatic of many larger things, but also that is a there is a lot of complex dynamics that happen in a rain puddle that can explain many things. If we understand how surface tension affects microorganisms, for example, and we can explain all of the different microorganisms based on the relationship of surface tension, um, we have some really cool things that are going on in many different areas. And we can start having a conversation about, a whole new fields. Or, you look at what are some outside influences on this rain puddle, and maybe the how quickly it evaporates affects the amount of microorganisms in it. Like, there's just amazing things that you can think about that are just vitally important. And we think that the world is all solved and science is all this stuff solved. No, we've got unbelievable amounts of stuff to solve and to ponder about and think about that we're just really starting, to be honest. We really are. The way that we look at the world in this sort of scientific way is really only 100 years old, maybe 150 years old tops. But really, it's probably more like 50 or 60 years old of sort of mainstream science, the way that we understand it, with real legitimate scientists studying the world. I mean, we just have so much that we can discover and think about, and the world is truly amazing. We just simply have to start looking at the stuff. So, coming back to this explanations of how the economy works, um, these explanations are all novice. They're all really not great. And the fact is, we still don't know. We still can explain things in many different ways. We still have a lot to discover. And we simply have to just get going with it and make these discoveries, push these things out, really have fun, and just explore the way that we are kids, and we try to extend that as long as we possibly can, because man, the world is far complicated than anybody ever thinks. But you know what, you have to have that strength to go and keep exploring and keep having fun and being excited about the world. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.